Before diving into this incredible story, remember to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, every story has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. Clara Dawson was driving late into the night along the winding road that snaked through the misty hills of Brooksville. The rain fell in heavy curtains, hitting the windshield hard, and the headlights of oncoming cars created blinding flashes. Her mind, tormented by recent betrayals at work and in her personal life, was elsewhere. Every conversation she'd had with her friends and colleagues replayed itself, burning her with a dull, silent anger. Suddenly, a car appeared out of nowhere, skidded on the wet asphalt, and crashed head-on into her vehicle. The impact was brutal. Clara felt her body thrown forward, the world transforming into a spiral of light and pain. Her thoughts became a jumble of fear, regret, and a strange sense of detachment. Then, blackness. The doctors pronounced her dead upon arrival at the hospital. Her weeping loved ones had gathered, unable to believe her sudden death. Her life seemed over. But as the silence of the morgue enveloped her body, a shiver ran through her. Something, a breath, an unknown energy, brought her back to herself. Her eyes opened onto a world she now perceived differently. Every detail was sharper, every face clearer. She was no longer the same. Clara sat up in her hospital bed, her heart beating irregularly, and a strange smile played on her lips. The pain of the accident and past betrayals was no longer her only emotion. She felt something more powerful, a thirst for justice and revenge. Those who had hurt, betrayed, or humiliated her would have to pay the price. From that moment on, Clara Dawson was no longer simply a victim. She was a reborn force, a shadow ready to strike with precision, determined to reclaim what had been stolen from her, her dignity, her respect, and the power to change the fate of those who had believed they could destroy her. Clara Dawson opened her eyes, but this time, the world around her felt different. The white walls of the hospital room, the steady beeping of the monitors, and the antiseptic smell of the room were no longer familiar, they had something cold and unsettling about them. Her body ached with every movement, but a new energy surged within her, a fire that had never existed before. Beside the bed, her mother and brother watched her, their eyes red with tears, unable to hide their relief. "Clara, you're back," her mother whispered, trembling. Clara stared at her for a moment, a barely perceptible smile on her lips. It wasn't the smile of a girl who had just escaped death. It was the smile of someone who understood that her second chance wasn't about becoming the same person again. Memories of past betrayals resurfaced, the colleague who had sabotaged her career for a promotion, her former best friend who had divulged her deepest secrets, and the lover who had abandoned her for another, taking advantage of her moments of vulnerability. Each face appeared in her mind with chilling clarity, and Clara felt anger rising, but not blind anger, a cold, methodical anger. As she slowly rose, her muscles still fragile, Clara knew the hospital was only a place of transition. She had to leave before anyone noticed the new intensity in her eyes. She straightened, took one step, then another, each movement calculated, precise. She was no longer simply Clara Dawson, the victim of an accident and life's injustices. She was Clara Dawson, the survivor, and soon, those who had hurt her would understand that every betrayal had a price. That night, as she silently left the hospital, she made a pact with herself. Her rebirth would not just be a second chance at life, it would be a rebirth to demand justice. The town of Brooksville was still unaware of the shadow that had just risen. And soon, that shadow would strike. Since her return to life, Clara Dawson had developed a new acuity. Every detail, every gesture, every word of the people around her now seemed charged with meaning. She spent her days silently observing those who had hurt her, mentally noting their habits, their weaknesses, and their little lies. She started with her colleagues at the office, where the betrayal had begun. Michael Trent, the arrogant colleague who had stolen her promotion, sat at his desk, laughing at a joke his subordinates had made. Clara watched him through the tinted mirror of the coffee cup in her hands. Every nervous tick, every forced smile was registered in her mind. She knew exactly how to strike where he was most vulnerable, his public image, his consuming ambition. Then there was Vanessa, her former close friend. Vanessa had never been able to accept Clara's success and had leaked personal secrets to everyone, slowly destroying Clara's reputation. Clara remembered the pain and humiliation of that betrayal perfectly. Now, she simply smiled inwardly, knowing that the karma she was about to unleash would be relentless. Even the most insignificant people who had contributed to her downfall, like some employees of her former favorite cafe who had spread rumors about her, were watched. Clara knew that every detail mattered. Every lie, every act of arrogance or selfishness became a piece of her future plan for revenge. But it wasn't just a matter of personal revenge. Clara had learned something important from this ordeal: life was fragile, and those who thought they could hurt others with impunity would see their world crumble before their eyes. She began to formulate her strategy, like a general preparing her battlefield, every action calculated, every movement precise. That night, as she walked home, Clara looked at herself in the mirror of her apartment. She saw herself not just as the woman she once was, but as a new version of herself, calm, determined, and ready to reclaim what was hers. Her heart beat with a new intensity, a mixture of vengeance and newfound power. She knew one thing for certain: nothing and no one would stop her. The next day, Clara Dawson resumed her daily routine as if nothing had happened. Her colleagues saw her enter the office, smiling, polite, almost innocent. No one could have guessed the storm raging behind her calm, bright eyes. She had learned to control her emotions, to mask her anger and pain behind a flawless facade. At lunch, she sat in the cafeteria, discreetly observing Michael Trent, her sworn enemy, as he chatted with other colleagues. Every laugh he made, every seemingly nonchalant gesture, fueled the meticulously constructed plan in Clara's mind. She made mental notes: his habits, his weaknesses, his dependence on the opinions of others. With Vanessa, she adopted a different approach. Clara pretended to ignore old grudges, speaking gently and cordially when she ran into her former friend in the hallway. But behind that sweet smile lay a precise intention: every word spoken, every calculated gesture, would later be used against her. At home, Clara practiced transforming herself completely: her posture, her gaze, her body language. She wanted the world to continue seeing her as the woman she had always been: kind, naive, even vulnerable. In reality, she was becoming an expert in the art of subtle manipulation. Every interaction was a test, every reaction a clue to her future plan. Her nights were different. Clara immersed herself in research: human psychology, manipulation techniques, strategies for discrediting or exposing enemies without being detected. She created detailed files on everyone who had hurt her, noting the smallest details that could give her an advantage. The mask of normalcy allowed her to move forward without arousing suspicion. Those who had humiliated her continued to underestimate her, thinking she was weak or fragile. But Clara knew that this feigned calm was the key to her revenge: the safer they felt, the more spectacular their downfall would be. And deep down, only one thought remained: this was just the beginning. The real game had barely started. Clara Dawson had waited for the right moment. Michael Trent, her arrogant former colleague, had just released a statement boasting of his success at the company, presenting himself as an impeccable leader. Clara had waited patiently, observing his every gesture, every smile, every superficial arrogance. Everything she had learned about him would finally come in handy. It began with small, subtle actions. A carefully crafted anonymous email slipped into her superior's inbox, revealing contradictions and manipulations Michael had orchestrated to secure his promotion. No one knew Clara was the author. The chaos began silently, but inevitably. Michael first noticed small incidents: colleagues who seemed to avoid him, glances that sized him up with suspicion. Then came the direct questions from his superiors, which, although polite, were becoming increasingly insistent. Clara watched from afar, an almost imperceptible smile on her lips, savoring every moment of her calculated downfall. But she wasn't content with mere disruption. Clara knew that to truly strike, she had to hit where it hurt most: his public reputation. She circulated, still anonymously, documents proving that Michael had manipulated and deceived not only her, but other employees as well, to advance his career. The evidence was irrefutable, and soon, Michael found himself under the suspicious and critical gaze of everyone he had respected. This first act of revenge had been meticulously planned, and it worked perfectly. Clara wasn't jubilant in the conventional sense. Her smile was calm, almost glacial. It wasn't the satisfaction of raw anger, but the confirmation that her plan was working. She had regained control, and every enemy would soon understand that she was no longer the naive victim they had once known. That night, as she walked home, Clara sensed something new. Fear was beginning to spread among those who had betrayed her. And that was exactly what she wanted. The game of revenge had only just begun, and the field was now hers. After her initial success, Clara Dawson realized she could no longer rely on isolated strikes. Every person who had betrayed, humiliated, or underestimated her had to be studied, analyzed, and struck at the precise moment their downfall would be most effective. She became a silent, almost invisible observer, stalking her enemies in their daily routines. She began by creating a mental map of everyone. Michael Trent was her first example, but others followed. Vanessa, the jealous ex-friend, continued to frequent the same places as before, confident and unaware of the storm that was brewing. Her superiors, colleagues, even some passing friends who had contributed to her suffering, were all noted in her mental notebooks. Clara knew that revenge had to be strategic. It couldn't just explode randomly, it had to strike with precision. She began discreetly gathering information, habits, relationships, social networks, internal rivalries, and even the little secrets they thought were well hidden. Every detail became a potential weapon. The hunt sometimes took subtle forms. Clara would pretend to cross paths with her enemies by chance in public places, observing their reactions, their arrogance, or their nervousness. Sometimes, she would send out small, anonymous rumors to test their vulnerability and gauge their reaction. She never acted rashly, every move was calculated to maximize its future impact. During those silent nights, Clara often sat at her window, watching the sleeping city, considering each plan. She felt her power grow with each piece of information she gathered. The people who had hurt her became, in their eyes, pawns in a game whose rules she now held. The process was long, methodical, and precise, but Clara knew that patience was essential. One mistake, one hasty move, and her plan could collapse. She was prepared to wait, to observe, to learn, until the perfect moment to strike. This hunt wasn't just a means of revenge, it was a test for herself. It measured her own self-control, her patience, and her intelligence. And she knew one thing for certain: when she acted, it would be final. None of her enemies would be able to ignore the significance of her rebirth. Clara Dawson had learned the art of camouflage. In public, she continued to display the charming smile and gentle demeanor everyone knew. Her colleagues believed her to be fragile, her friends thought they had seen her fall, and even those who had wronged her completely underestimated her. But behind that impeccable mask, a shadow moved, silent, methodical, and ready to strike. She began to combine her plans. The individual attacks had worked, but now she wanted to amplify the effect by creating situations where multiple enemies would be exposed simultaneously. For example, Michael Trent and Vanessa, unaware of Clara's actions, found themselves in situations where their own secrets were revealed, without anyone suspecting her direct involvement. Clara used every detail she had gathered: conversations, habits, fragile alliances, and personal rivalries. Every interaction was manipulated to create tension and suspicion. She sent subtle messages, discreet evidence, and anonymous suggestions that were enough to sow doubt in people's minds. The pieces moved exactly as she had planned. In her apartment, Clara carefully studied her victims' reactions. Facial expressions, nervous gestures, overheard conversations, everything helped her refine her plans. She was beginning to understand the mechanics of human relationships better than anyone else. This mastery gave her a sense of power she had never felt before. Yet Clara did not let herself be carried away by blind anger. Every action was calculated, precise, and deliberate. Her goal was not simply to punish, but to correct the order. She restored the balance, transforming fear and mistrust into instruments of personal justice. And as she watched the first cracks appear in her enemy's facade, Clara felt something new taking root within her, not only vengeance, but also the certainty that she now controlled her destiny. The shadow behind her smile was no longer simply a strategy, it was her new identity. That night, watching the city shimmer under the streetlights, Clara knew the most intense part of her plan was yet to come. Every smile she wore masked calculation, every word seemed innocent but carried an invisible power. The victims of her rebirth had seen nothing yet. Clara Dawson's patience had finally paid off. The first results of her methodical revenge were now becoming apparent. Those who had hurt and betrayed her were beginning to feel the first tremors of what Clara had orchestrated for weeks. Michael Trent, once arrogant and self-assured, was now the target of whispers throughout the company. His colleagues, intrigued and suspicious, began to question his competence and integrity. Mistakes he had carefully concealed in the past resurfaced, amplified by subtle documents Clara had circulated anonymously. His world of certainty was slowly crumbling, and Clara watched with icy calm, savoring the spectacle without ever revealing herself. Vanessa, her jealous ex-friend, found herself publicly humiliated at a social event. Clara had subtly orchestrated the leak of information about a past betrayal by Vanessa, putting her in a position where she could no longer control the image she projected. Friends and colleagues who once adored her turned away, and Vanessa realized too late that her arrogance had been her downfall. Even minor figures who had contributed to Clara's suffering felt the backlash. Anonymous rumors and the small traps set by Clara sowed confusion, arguments, and mistrust. Everyone, in their own way, began to pay for their past actions. But Clara's revenge wasn't simply about punishment, she wanted her enemies to understand that they had underestimated a force they thought had been destroyed. Every fall, every humiliation, was a silent message: Clara Dawson was no longer the victim they had known. She was the implacable force returning to demand justice. This progression strengthened Clara. She felt her confidence and control grow with each reaction from her enemies. Her revenge became not only a means of personal redress, but also a mastered art. Manipulation, observation, and patience transformed each move into a work of precision. As she settled onto her apartment balcony that evening, gazing at the illuminated city, Clara realized that true power lay not in anger, but in total control of the situation. Her enemies were falling, one by one, and she was now the only one who wrote the rules. Clara Dawson had now crossed a line from which there was no turning back. The first victims of her vengeance had fallen, and the consequences of her actions were rippling far beyond what she had anticipated. The suspicious glances, whispers, and doubts she had sown were beginning to erupt into open conflict. Some enemies were starting to look for scapegoats, but no one suspected Clara. Yet, this newfound attention was beginning to weigh on her. Her loved ones, her family, a few remaining loyal friends, were starting to notice that she was changing. Her perfect composure, her constant smile, even her daily routine seemed too calculated, too precise. Clara now had to juggle two realities, maintaining her facade in public while pursuing her revenge with ruthless precision. Her targets, aware they were under attack but unable to understand by whom or how, began to actively defend themselves. Michael Trent sought evidence to exonerate himself, while Vanessa attempted to restore her image within the same social circles she had previously manipulated. These reactions provided Clara with additional opportunities but also increased the risk of being discovered. Clara felt a growing unease. Revenge, though satisfying, was beginning to profoundly change her. Her mind was no longer focused on rebuilding her life, but on perfecting her plans, studying reactions, and staging each humiliation. Each success reinforced her dependence on this dynamic. Despite this, she knew she had reached the point of no return. The sweet, naive woman the world had known was gone. Every action Clara took was now calculated, methodical, and ruthless. She could no longer afford to fail. And that night, as she planned her next move, she realized that her revenge touched on something bigger, the complete transformation of the order around her. The rules they thought they knew no longer applied. And Clara Dawson, now master of her own destiny and that of her enemies, was ready to go even further. The long-awaited moment had finally arrived. Clara Dawson stood face to face with the man who had caused the greatest trauma of her life, Derek Lawson, her former mentor and rival disguised as a friend. For years, he had manipulated, humiliated, and betrayed Clara to serve his own ambitions. But now, the tables had turned. Clara was waiting for him in a neutral meeting room, her face calm, her gaze piercing. Derek entered, confident, completely unaware of the extent of the transformation she had undergone. He smiled, thinking he recognized the young woman he had once underestimated. But Clara was no longer the woman he knew. "Clara. I didn't expect to see you here." "I'm here, Derek, to finish what you started, and to show you that you never understood who I really was," she replied, her voice soft but full of intensity. The confrontation was as much psychological as physical. Clara calmly laid out her observations, revealing Derek's past manipulations and betrayals. Every detail, every secret of Derek's, every lie he thought he could get away with, was presented with precision, leaving Derek unable to retaliate. His arrogance cracked, replaced by disbelief and fear. Clara didn't need to shout or threaten. Her composure, preparation, and calm were enough to shift the power dynamic. Derek, who once controlled every situation, now found himself helpless against Clara's cold, methodical demeanor. She concluded the confrontation with a simple warning: never underestimate someone you've hurt. Because sooner or later, they'll get back up. And when they do, they won't stop until justice is served. This encounter marked a turning point for Clara. Not only had she gained the upper hand over her greatest enemy, but she had also realized that she now possessed a power that no one could ignore. Her revenge was no longer merely personal, it was a demonstration of power and mastery. As she left the room, Derek remained frozen, aware for the first time that he had been completely manipulated. Clara, on the other hand, moved forward with a newfound serenity, ready to close this chapter of her life and decide what her rebirth would mean for her future. Clara Dawson sat quietly in her apartment, watching the glittering city in the distance. The revenge she had patiently and precisely orchestrated had reached its climax. Her enemies had been exposed, humiliated, or forced to confront their own weaknesses. Michael Trent had lost all credibility within the company, Vanessa had been ostracized by her peers, and Derek Lawson, once a master manipulator, finally understood the magnitude of his mistakes. But the silence that followed these victories was strange. Clara realized that her rebirth had transformed her more profoundly than she had imagined. The anger and thirst for justice that had driven her now gave way to a subtle emptiness. Her actions had released her pain, but they had also stripped away a part of her humanity. She was no longer the same woman who had been wounded, she had become an implacable, almost formidable force. Yet, an unexpected feeling took hold: freedom. Clara was no longer defined by the betrayals of the past or by the expectations of those who had underestimated her. She had taken control of her life, her destiny, and her power. Revenge had been her rebirth, but now she had to decide what she would do with this new identity. She smiled slightly, thinking about her future. Perhaps she would return to a normal life, perhaps she would create something new, using the strength she had discovered within herself to build herself up and protect those she loved. Or perhaps she would continue to navigate this world with the mastery and foresight she had acquired, choosing her battles with prudence and strategy. Clara stood up, looked at herself in the mirror, and saw not only the woman she had become, but also the woman she had always been deep down: resilient, intelligent, and capable of overcoming any hardship. She realized then that true power lay not in revenge, but in the ability to transform pain into strength and to choose her own path, free from judgment or constraint. As night fell on Brooksville, Clara Dawson stepped away from the mirror, leaving behind the shadow of her past. Her rebirth was complete. She was no longer simply a survivor, she was the architect of her life and her destiny, ready to write the next chapter on her own terms.